Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here this evening. I am Gretchen Hockmeister, the Executive Director of the Hotchkiss Library of
Definitely,
Sharon.
we've got that. We're on.
And on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Norfolk Library and the Essex Public Library, I'm so happy to welcome you. One of the silver linings of the pandemic has certainly been the increased collaboration
software,
between.
but we're getting Zoom.
Could you please mute yourselves? Thank you. One of the silver linings of the pandemic has been the collaboration between Connecticut libraries. So I'm very grateful for the participation tonight of our partner libraries. So thank you, Anne Havemeyer from Norfolk and Anne Thompson from Essex. And also a special shout out to my friend Benta Busby, who introduced me to Michael so that we could host this program. Just a little housekeeping before we begin. We ask you to keep your microphones muted. Michael's going to read a selection for us and speak a bit about the book and his experience, and then we'll ask him a few questions. And then at that point, we will open it up for your questions. We have a large crowd, so please send your questions to us through the chat function, and we will read your questions to Michael. If you prefer, you may raise your hand later by clicking the reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to find you in the little window and call on you. So it's so exciting to see so many participants tonight to learn about the translation of the work of an author who was virtually unknown in this country 2 years ago, and whose autobiographical text, the Copenhagen Trilogy, was named one of the 10 best books of 2021 by the New York Times Book Review, a best book of the year by NPR, and was nearly universally lauded by reviewers across the country. Tonight, Tove Ditlevsen's translator, Michael Favala Goldman, will tell us about the long history and translation of the 3 texts that comprise the trilogy. Michael is himself an accomplished poet, jazz musician, teacher, and Danish literary translator based in Northampton, Mass. He's just finished translating a collection of Ditlevsen short fiction entitled The Trouble with Happiness, which will be published this spring. And one of those stories was recently published in the New Yorker. Perhaps you had a chance to read it there. So we're thrilled to have you here with us, Michael. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Gretchen, and the other libraries for hosting us tonight. So here's a couple lines that Tove Ditlevsen wrote in Denmark in 1971. Jeg har det godt i denne tid. Jeg skal giftes. Jeg skal have et barn. Jeg har en ung mand, jeg elsker. Og snart skal vi have vores eget hjem. And this is what I translated in 2017. I feel good these days. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have a baby. I'm in love with a young man, and soon we're going to have our own home. And the passage continues. I tell Ebbe that I'll never leave him, and that I can't stand it when life gets so complicated, like it's been recently. He lifts my chin and kisses me. It could be, he says, that if you're complicated, then your life gets to be like that too. So that's from Dependency, the 3rd book of the Copenhagen Trilogy. Now, in this passage, Tove had just left her first husband, Viggo, after 1 year of marriage, for a man more her own age. And Tove Ditlevsen did lead quite a complicated life, which I became very closely acquainted with starting in 2016. I was on my way out of Denmark, browsing the airport bookstore, and I came across her memoir, Gift. A number of Tove Ditlevsen's books were being reissued because it was nearing her centennial, 100 years from her birth. So I picked up Gift, not knowing much about it, except that the word gift in Danish, when translated into English, means both poison and married. So as it turned out, Gift was the account of her life from the age of about 23 to 35. these 12 years during which she became a high-profile, best-selling author that she had dreamed of becoming. She also had 4 marriages, 2 back-alley abortions, and a 5-year near-fatal addiction to opioids. And all this in just over 100 pages. Yet despite all this drama in her life, she maintains the sense of humor throughout the book. And I could feel her drive for self-determination and independence and carving her way in life. And also she had this ability to expose herself so completely and raw, both herself and also the people around her, with a remarkable vulnerability. So a little bit about her. She was born during World War I in 1917, and she grew up in inner city Copenhagen. She was a teenager during the Depression, and her education ended at middle school. Her father was a furnace stoker, and she had to go to work to help support the family. So she was a self-taught author. She did not go to school to become an author. As a young adult, she experienced the occupation of Denmark by Nazi Germany during World War II. And she believed that her ticket out of a working poor existence would be marrying a husband who was wealthier, or possibly her writing. She ended up marrying Viggo Müller, who was over 30 years older than her. And he helped her get a break to get her first book of poetry published. And she wrote about a book a year for the rest of her life. 11 books of poetry, 7 novels, 4 collections of short stories, 4 memoirs, and other books. Besides that, she was Denmark's Dear Abby. She was the advice columnist for Denmark's most popular women's magazine for 20 years. All told, she is one of the most important and best-selling authors of 20th century Denmark. And she had that complicated life that I mentioned. She was hospitalized several times for psychiatric problems and drug use, and she died by a suicide overdose of pills in 1976 at the age of 59. So in reading her memoir, I felt the potency of Tove Ditlevsen's writing immediately, which is both her voice, her writing voice, but also her choice of subject matter, what she chooses to write about. Now, she was a poet first, and that comes through clearly because her prose does not digress. Her prose is concise and precise. There is no fat on her pages. And she writes with this authority, as if she's telling just the truth, nothing elaborated on, in confidence, as if you are her only audience. I love that strong voice that she has. I distinctly remember saying to myself after I read the last page of Gift and putting the book down, I think I just read a masterpiece. So being a Danish translator, I looked up to see if the book had been translated into English, and it had not, even though it was nearly 50 years old. So I applied for a grant to do a sample translation. I got the grant. And when I'd finished the 15 pages, I decided that I wasn't going to stop. I was just going to keep going on my own time because I was so captivated by her story and the message of her life. So I translated the rest and hoped that I would find a publisher for it. So let me read 2 excerpts from Dependency. Maybe some of you haven't read it yet. Most reviewers mention that Dependency is the most harrowing and dramatic of the trilogy, of the 3 books. And so I'm going to read from 2 sections. The first one is her first abortion. So the birth of their first child put a great strain on her marriage to Ebbe. So when Tove got pregnant a second time, she was determined to have an abortion, even though they were illegal. And eventually she was able to turn up a phone number for an abortion doctor, and she set up a time. I'm going to read just the first line in Danish. Lægen modtager mig entréen, hvor en uafskærmet pære hænger og dingler i en krog i loftet. Han virker nervøs og fornærmet. The doctor greets me in the entry, where a bare light bulb dangles from a hook in the ceiling. He seems nervous and grouchy. The money, he says flatly, holding out his hand. I give it to him, and he nods toward the examination room. He's about 50, small and shriveled, and the corners of his mouth droop as if he has never smiled. Come on up, he says, slapping his hand on the examination table with the hanging straps for patients' legs. I lie down with an anxious glance at the side table, which has on it a row of shiny, pointed instruments. Will this hurt? I ask. A bit, he says, only a second. He talks like a telegram, as if he's trying to limit the use of his vocal cords. I shut my eyes, and a sharp pain darts through my body, but I don't make a sound. Done, he says. If you notice blood or fever, call Dr. Lauritsen. No hospitals. Don't mention my name. In this next passage, Tove has had an ear operation. So during her marriage to Ebbe, Tove has a one-night stand with a medical student named Carl. And then she marries Carl because he's giving her injections of the opioid Demerol pretty much on demand. Tove then starts faking an earache so she can get extra shots. So Carl sets up an ear operation for Tove's fake earache. And she writes, when I awoke from my anesthesia, my whole head was wrapped in gauze. And then I finally learned what an earache really was. I moaned in pain, rolling back and forth. This hurts so much, I told the doctor. Can't you give me something for the pain? Of course, he said, you can have aspirin. That's the strongest medicine we give in this ward. We don't turn people into addicts. When Carl finally arrived, he had his brown briefcase and inside it the blessed syringe. And when he gave me a shot in the open vein, I said, you have to come by all the time. I've never felt pain like this in my whole life. And here they only give you aspirin. They might as well give you sugar pills, he mumbled. Speak louder, I said, I can't hear you. You're deaf in that ear, he said. You will be the rest of your life, but at least it won't hurt anymore. This lasted for 14 days. Carl stayed home from work to give me shots whenever I asked. I lay motionless and limp in my bed and felt like I was being rocked to sleep in warm green water. Nothing else in the world mattered to me but staying in this blissful state. Carl told me lots of people are deaf in one ear and that it doesn't really matter. I didn't care because it was worth it. One night I woke up and realized the pain was just about gone, but I was cold and shivering and so dehydrated I had to use my fingers to pry apart my lips. Carl got up, drunk with sleep, and gave me a shot. I don't know what we're going to do, he said. When that vein clogs up too, maybe we can find one in your foot. So I completed my manuscript and started pitching it to various publishers, and I was getting nowhere. And little did I know that two British publishers were seeking actively a female Scandinavian author that they could promote. And they were guided toward Tove Ditlevsen by the Danish Arts Foundation. And then I was guided to these two publishers by Tove's Danish publisher Gyldendal. So I sent these two publishers my manuscript, and they had a bidding war over it, which resulted in Tove Ditlevsen becoming the first Danish writer in over 50 years to be published by Penguin Classics. My manuscript of Gift, now entitled Dependency, was then combined with two memoirs of Ditlevsen that were translated by Tina Nunnally and published 35 years ago and out of print, and that was Childhood and Youth. So together, the three memoirs became the Copenhagen Trilogy, which I think was a brilliant stroke of marketing by Penguin to pair these two older translations with my brand new one. So the translation of a book can greatly expand its readership, especially in this case where Denmark and Danish is such a small language, small country. And I often think of my translations as an act of service, both to the author for giving them a larger readership, also to the culture it comes from, also to the cause of world literature, and also to the individual readers that will read it and how it will impact them. And Dependency struck me as, more than any book that I translated, as one that could really serve humanity, and the US in particular, given the opioid crisis. I'm sure you've seen in the news how overdoses reached an all-time high last year. And then here we have this brilliant, unvarnished account from the inside of an addict's life experience, which I think can help increase understanding and empathy about that situation. Personally, I found the act of translating Dependency more devastating than any translation I've done. As I worked, I kept feeling like Tove was becoming my best friend and confidant, and yet she was betraying me in every chapter with her self-destructive choices. By the end, I think she taught me more about compassion than perhaps anyone I know. One aspect of this is that I realized while translating Dependency that I had an implicit bias and judgment about drug use and addiction and dependent behavior. Just from growing up and society and media, I had taken on the attitude that if someone was struggling with addiction or dependent behavior, then it must be their own fault. But in the process of working on this book and witnessing how Tove, who had everything going for her, fell prey to addiction, I realized that there's a much more compassionate and supportive alternative to my previous judgmental thinking. I learned that dependent behavior is a universal element of being human, which I also share, and not an individual's fault to be judged and dismissed. So this kind of internal transformation process through literature is what motivates and fuels my mission as a translator to make great writers like Tove Ditlevsen available. I find that literature at its best helps to soften the shells around people's hearts, like it did my own. And this helps to increase compassion, connection to others, and to ourselves. So I'm really happy to announce that, as Gretchen mentioned, I've translated 21 short stories of Tove Ditlevsen, and they're forthcoming in a collection on April 19th this year as The Trouble with Happiness. I can share this is the cover. So you can look forward to that. Many of the stories in this book touch on various aspects of human relationships, like how we often seek happiness by attempting to get people close to us to meet our expectations. I am currently working on 2 other manuscripts of Tove Ditlevsen's writing. One is a translation of her later poetry called The Adults. And when that appears, that would be her first poetry collection to appear in English. And I'm also working on one of her early novels, For the Child's Sake. So excerpts from both of these works have been published by World Literature Today. And if you look up in the chat, I have a link there to those. So you can check that out later if you want. I also put in the chat a link to my website, which has various videos and blogs about translation, about the trilogy, about poetry. And you can also subscribe to my newsletter there. And you could also subscribe to my YouTube channel. You could also follow me on Facebook for frequent updates about what I'm up to and the work that I'm doing. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know librarians have some questions for me first, and then we'll open it up to the group.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. That's really amazing and fascinating. What a journey you were on, translating just those 100 pages. Incredible. You know, when I read the trilogy, the first 2 parts, you know, it's so at the end of the second part, she's going to have her first.
Okay. Gretchen, you're muted. You just got muted somehow.
Sorry.
Okay, back up 30 seconds.
Sorry about that. You know, when I read the trilogy initially, and you get to the end of the second part, Youth, it's such a triumph for her, a victory that her first volume of poetry is going to be published. And it's so touching how she wants to keep it a secret at first. You know, it's her, you know, even though she's been yearning for this recognition, she keeps it for herself. And then you start the third part, and she, you know, it's not very long before this downward spiral begins into the addictive behavior. So how do you see those 2 parts of her, you know, being intertwined, being a writer, an artist, a poet, and being an addict?
Yeah. It's a good question. I'm reminded of a quote from I think it's from Youth. Let's see. Oh, here it is. From Childhood, where she's read Gorky. She's like 9 years old, and she's reading Russian poets, and she's so inspired that she's 7 or 8, sorry, that she says happily to her family, "I want to be a poet too." Immediately, my father frowned and said severely, "Don't be a fool. A girl can't be a poet." Offended and hurt, I withdrew into myself again, while my mother and my brother Edvin laughed at my crazy idea. I vowed never to reveal my dreams to anyone again. So Tove, like I said, she never went to school to be a writer. It almost like I don't know that she was a writer. I mean, that's just who she was. She was an artist and as a writer. And she also could see that was not always safe. And you know, being poor and being seen as unworthy because she was a woman of being a writer. I think that that upbringing really haunted her throughout her life, and that she had a lot of difficulty just being herself and being her talent, and also perceiving. I mean, you could tell by her writing that she perceives everything in such detail, and I think that was a burden for her, and also a gift for us, that she was able to take all of that and channel it through her writing. but the suffering that came with it, I think that is why the drugs had such a strong pull on her, because it softened the edges of life that otherwise were a little too stark and strong.
Well, thank you. Has her reputation in Denmark pretty much, she was very popular at the time of her death, I assume, and is it continued through, since then? And how has the publication of her work in English and all this new renown in England and America affected, or influenced her standing in Denmark? And are there other translations in other countries happening now, other languages?
Yes. So let me answer your last question first. So English is a big way a gateway language, in a way that her memoirs had only been translated in Scandinavia, as far as I know, up until just a few years ago. And the emergence of the trilogy and all of the popularity and readership around that have made it so that now the books have been sold to over 20 countries. So her books are now, because Danish is not spoken or read by very many publishers around the world.
Right.
Whereas English, almost every publisher has access to English.
Right.
So they can see the reviews, and they can read the books for themselves and say that this is top-notch literature, and then they can get behind it. But it's, in a way, books can be kind of trapped in a small language center like Denmark, like Danish, and being translated into English can be a liberation of the work, in a way. So yeah, when her centennial came up, remember the book that I picked up about 5 years ago, some of her books were starting to be promoted. There was a small group of Danish literary women, especially in Denmark, that were trying to revive interest in her around her centennial. And so we can thank them, but we can also see that as a somewhat of a symptom of her reputation in Denmark as a writer for women. Because during her life, she was never invited to join the Danish Academy. She was never invited to be part of the literati of her day, because the mostly male patriarchal system of literature during her life saw her work as domestic and as mining her own life for her writing, which they didn't consider real writing. And of course, so in a way, she was ahead of her time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, today we see that everywhere. That this is commonplace. At the time, it was not. But not only did she do that, which was not necessarily accepted, but she did it at such a high level that today we can read it and say that she was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And still to this day, I think the Copenhagen Trilogy in a little bit has mystified many Danish readers, because like why is this women's writer suddenly blowing up in the United States? And as part of my message is that she didn't just write for women; she also wrote for me, and I think all of humanity, because what she speaks to around dependency and vulnerability and dependency, that this is something that we all can face. Even though it's difficult, it's something that we all need to become acquainted.
Great. Anne from Essex, do you have any questions for Michael?
Absolutely, I do. Michael, thank you so much for this. It's just a captivating look at somebody that obviously a lot of us are not familiar with, and terribly motivating, at least for me. I can speak for myself, to want to go learn more about her. So I hate to change the subject a little bit and turn it towards the process of translation and how that works as, so I'm very naive about how that works, particularly with multiple countries going on. So can you walk us through that, please?
Yeah, so translation is much slower than reading. Because as a translator, I am being led by the text, word by word and phrase by phrase, but I'm not translating the words. I'm translating the meaning and even the tone and the ambiance that the words create between the words and between the lines. So it's, I've learned that your mother tongue has a language center in one part of your brain. And when you learn a second language, that actually is in another part of the brain. And so in a way, I'm taking in the text from one part, and then the meaning kind of goes off into this third place where words don't necessarily exist, where there's emotion and there's concept. And then I'm distilling that back into English in the best way that I can, using my experience and my vocabulary, knowing and my perception of what I believe she meant. So there's a kind of a distillation happening through my brain, but also through my body, that like almost like an actor, like a method actor on stage needs to kind of become the character in the play, so that you forget you're watching an actor. That when I'm writing, I need to write as much as possible as her, so the reader doesn't recognize me. It's a very deep reading, and it involves feeling as much as possible, as much as I can, to stretch so I can feel what I believe she was feeling and be able to then write that. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's fabulous. Thank you. Did you read everything you could that she had written, so that, you know, in a way trying to know every word that she used to describe things, and how she might repeat some of that to, you know, what her favorite ways of describing things were, particularly then having to work between the poetry and the literature. Did the reading the poetry help you translate the literature?
So I've read a lot of her books, but this is actually one of the first books I read, and I've read most of her books since I did this translation. So I can't say that it helped me, but it did help me understand how brilliant she is. And it also gave me, I learned more about her life. I learned more about her different ways of writing, and I see the crossover as well. Like, for example, in the story that Gretchen mentioned in the New Yorker, it's called The Umbrella, and it centers around a young woman in her apartment building who would leave every night holding this beautiful yellow umbrella to go off and actually be a prostitute. And she in childhood, you might remember, there's just like a one paragraph mention of this memory, but then she turned that into a 10-page short story. This woman's experience of having an umbrella, et cetera. And that's actually the opening story of The Trouble with Happiness. So I make those connections throughout her authorship, that something that's mentioned here might end up being expanded, extrapolated into a great story in another place, and also in her poetry as well. I can see experiences in her poetry, like around her abortion. There, translated an abortion poem, and I could definitely see the similarities of how she drew on her experience.
Fabulous. Thank you. I don't want to, I'm a pig about questions, so I want to constrain myself. Anne Havemeyer, did you have questions?
Well, I just wanted to follow up, Anne, on your question to Michael about process. I'm curious about, first of all, I'm assuming that you read the first 2 volumes of the trilogy in Danish. And I'm curious about how you felt about their translation. Well, specifically because yours is paired with them as a trilogy, and whether that was, I'm just wondering how you felt about those.
Yeah, so I did read the first 2 in Danish and in English. But I read them after I translated Gift, or dependency. So, so I didn't, in fact, when I translated Dependency, I hadn't even thought about that there were other memoirs. I was so enthralled with this book that was my laser focus. So it wasn't until later that I discovered the other two books and that they were going to be packaged together, which turned out to be a brilliant idea. And I made the acquaintance of Tina Nunnally, who is a brilliant translator. She translates from Danish and from Norwegian. And she discovered Tove long before I did, long before anyone else did, I guess, in the United States. She translated those books just a dozen years after they were written. And whereas now we had to wait another 35 years before we could get all three of them. So I'm indebted to her. And I think she's also indebted to me. She's told me several times that she's so thankful that I did the third book, because she knew how hard it was to work on that text, and she really wasn't interested. So she's thankful that I was able to do that.
Thank you. Should we move to questions from the floor?
Yes.
Sure, we have a bunch. I can jump right in there. Ingeleza asked, what prompted you to learn Danish?
Sure, be happy to tell you a little bit about that. So I don't know if you can see me, if you want to spotlight me again or whatever, but when I was 17, I had the chance to go to Denmark through a Rotary Club summer exchange program. And while I was there for 4 weeks, I fell in love with a Danish young woman. So we wrote letters and barely saw each other for many years. But 2 years later, I was back in Denmark to visit her, also over the summer. And I had dropped out of college and I wanted to stay abroad, and she helped me to get a job on a farm way out in the country in southern Denmark. She had to leave to go back to work in England, and I was determined to learn Danish because I needed to impress her father. That was the main thing. But I also just wanted to be more a part of her life, to be able to be with her friends and her family and participate with them on their terms as a Danish speaker. And so I dedicated myself. My main way of learning Danish, besides trying out my Danish on the few people who lived on the farm, was I got a Danish copy of Catcher in the Rye, and I started to read it with a dictionary. And I read the entire book with a dictionary, wrote down every word I didn't know, figured out the grammar, started to write parts of my letters to my girlfriend in Danish, tried out my Danish language on the grocer and the farmer and the son and the farmhand. And since then, I basically learned Danish in a couple of months. And since then, I've been reading Danish books. I read Danish books for 25 years for fun, most Danish classics, just to kind of keep up my language, because I love literature and books. I didn't start translating books till about 8 years ago. And that young Danish woman and I, we've been married for 32 years. And we've lived in Denmark, we've lived here, our children speak Danish. And I was actually a carpenter remodeler for most of my adult life. That was my main career. And I left that to pursue translating about 8 years ago. So thanks for that question.
Terrific. Brad has asked, I am also familiar with your translation of the Danish poet Knud Sorensen. What other Danish writers have you considered translating to introduce to a broader audience?
Yeah, if you go to michaelfavalagoldman.com and you click on books, there's 17 books there, I think. So some Danish authors that pretty high profile Danish authors besides Tove and Knud Sorensen are Benny Andersen, national poet of Denmark, who died about 3 years ago. I've done 2 volumes of his poetry. Susanne Borger, I did a book of her essays a couple of years ago. I've done 5 books by Cecil Birkgaard, who's one of the most prolific female writers of Danish literature. So there's a whole list of them there, and maybe I should add that every book that I've translated, except for one, has been my own choice. That is, from my many years of reading Danish, I knew who I wanted to translate. I knew who I wanted to bring into English because I felt that they were the best of the best. So I don't think you'll be disappointed by any of them.
Thank you.
Thanks
Just as a
for that.
follow-up to that, with some of the books that you've also translated, have you worked with the author of any of the authors who are still living? Have you, while you were translating, did you run things by them?
So so my entry into translation was this, and this will answer your question. So working as a carpenter, also being a musician, I went to my rehearsal with my band, my jazz band, one night, and I was talking to my guitarist before we got started, and he said that he was really, really down, and it was because his son's best friend had died suddenly in a ski accident. And so I knew a little bit of what he was going through because about 5 years previous to that, my best friend had died in a boating accident. And so we talked about that a little bit. And at this time, I had been reading poetry and essays about Benny Andersen. So I was reading his poetry, and he had written a poem about death that I loved because I felt like it turned the idea of death on its head. And I told him about it, how he wrote that when somebody dies, sometimes they become more alive to you than the people who are alive. And I made him smile, and I thought, you know what, he has to be able to read this poem. But of course he couldn't because it was in Danish. So I decided I'm going to go home, I'm going to work on this poem, I'm going to translate it so I can give it to him. And that was the first poem I translated. So if I could, let me read, I'm going to read, it actually became the title of this book, which is Benny Andersen's poetry, Something to Live Up To. Let me just read the first part of the poem. I'll read the first lines in Danish. Noget at leve op til. Jeg tæller ikke lige frem mine døde. Noter mig bare, at tallet stiger stødt. Men hvad er døde tal mod sprældøde venner? Something to live up to. I don't actually count my dead. Just notice that the amount is increasing steadily. But what are dead numbers compared with dead and kicking friends? I have nothing against the dead. Some of my best friends are dead. What strikes me is just their unfailing life energy, seen alongside numerous living who are more dead than alive. I know more not dead who bore me to death, while the really dead, the professional, are up and moving again at unexpected moments. So I translated this poem, and I was loving Benny Andersen's poetry because he has this ability to be both funny and deep and serious at the same time. And he was just so ingenious, such a brilliant writer. So I started to translate more of his poems in my free time. In the evenings, on the weekends, I would sit down and try and work out some of his poems in English. And when I got to like 50 of them, I thought, well, maybe I should let him know what I'm doing. Even though he's the national poet of Denmark and I'm a carpenter from Western Massachusetts, I thought, well, I'll just send him and just to let him know. And he ended up writing back saying he must have liked what I had sent, because he said, next time you're in Denmark, why don't you come visit me? So I said, okay. The next time my wife and I visited Denmark, which we do about every year because we have lots of family over there, we went to his house and had lunch with him, and at the end of lunch, he pulled out the packet that I sent him, and we start talking about translation and what word choices I made. And he knew English very well, even though we always spoke just in Danish. And we ended up playing music together because he's a brilliant pianist as well. And I brought my clarinet. And by the end of the lunch, he had invited me to come back in the spring and spend a couple of weeks with him, so that we could go over all my translation questions and see about preparing a large manuscript of his work to appear in English. And it ended up becoming both this volume, Something to Live Up To, and also a second volume called Certain Days, which have, between the two of them, you know, I'd say all of his most popular poems and all the ones that this kind of rose, the ones that rose to the top. That's his poetry book right there. It's 1,200 pages as collected poems. So I didn't do all of them, but we did quite a few. So that was my introduction into translation, was working with Benny Andersson. And then from there, with my background of just being a voracious reader, I had a lot of work lined up. Yeah.
That's so
Thank you.
cool. That's so cool. Abigail asks, I haven't read the book yet, but are there nuances of Tove's writing syntax images that you brought into English? And could you give us an example? I think she's asking a much more, my question much more articulately. So, my earlier question. Are there nuances of her writing that you could give us examples of?
So I'm not entirely sure what the question is. I mean, well, I don't know if this is part of it. But for example, there's no quotation marks. I don't know if you noticed that when you read the book, there's no quotation marks. And so as a translator, I wanted to preserve that. So that took some skill so that it would always be clear to the reader who was speaking and when the speaking ended. So that's a nuance of her writing that not everybody does. It makes the pages look a lot more clean somehow. And it was a challenge for me to be able to preserve her style that way. I'm not sure if that is an example.
I wonder if she means maybe, or in addition, some phrasings, if there are phrasings particularly that were maybe difficult to, you know, in the words between the lines kind of a thing, where
Yeah.
English didn't necessarily directly make that phrasing clear.
So I can't bring up any, I can't give you examples of any phrases right here, but what I can tell you is that if you look at a Danish dictionary and an English dictionary, the English dictionary is a lot bigger. And part of that reason is that in Danish, the same word can have a lot more meanings. And it's sort of like the Danish reader or the Danish listener is assumed to understand what the speaker means because they know Danish, they know the Danish culture. So a word might be used, in the same word might be used in several different places and needs to be translated differently into English because we have a much more nuanced and specific word for that. And so as a translator, that's the challenge for me, to not just translate the word, but translate the situation. Yeah. So, you know, so a word like, like angst, you know, it could be, you know, anxiousness, or it could be worry, or it could be hesitation, or I don't know. There's just all these different nuances, and I need to figure out which one fit. Yeah, so let me just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Well, you've, I think, put the difficulties of translating from one language to another in a nutshell. So, thank you. Are there any members, Susan wants to know if there are any members of Tove's family still around, and if so, how have they reacted to her wider fame and her growing influence?
Yeah, I don't, And she definitely has family, but I don't have any contact with them, and I can't say. Sorry, I can't answer that one.
Fair enough.
I will mention, I mentioned to the librarians before we started that Dependency, the third book, is coming out as a TV series in Denmark. It's going to be a 4-part series. I know that a lot of people have seen Borgen or Borgen, whatever, and other Danish mini-series that have been very popular. And so hopefully this one will become available to us as well. It's coming out next summer. It's 4 episodes, and each one is based on one of her marriages. So it should be pretty amazing. And so if her family is giving permission for things like that, then I think that they must be happy about what's going on.
Great. Very nice. Abigail, by the way, said, thank you. You answered her question exactly.
Okay.
Susan's asking a question that maybe we've already gone over, but I'll just throw it out there, is if she could read Tove in English, if it were, I'm guessing she means if it were originally written in English, how differently would the book feel in tone, in emotion, than it does in English? I think she means the Danish.
Well, so like what an English language writer, how would they write the story differently? It sounds like that's what the question is.
Basically.
Yeah.
Is there any, it brings me to maybe a tangential question. Is there anybody you know of, an author in English, an English, first language English author who writes at all similarly to Tove?
Yeah.
Stylistically, or
Yeah. I don't know. I'm sorry.
it seems unique.
I don't know. Her writing style is so pared down and clean that I love it. Absolutely love it. And partly what I love about her writing is this tension that she builds up in me as the reader, because when she is when she's writing humorously, like about cutting up her husband's clothing to make a dress for her mother and stuff like so endearing, right? And I just love how she can expose herself and her life, and then she turns and she makes some really, what I feel is these horrible decisions, but to her it's just, well, then I did this and then I did this. She seems to take herself so lightly, and meanwhile I'm watching her self-destruct and saying, no, don't do that, and yet she does it anyway. And she can write with such lightness over such over episodes that have such gravity, and that is this tension that's built up in me as a reader that is just phenomenal, and makes it a joy to read and painful to read at the same time. And there's just not a lot of people that do that for me.
Yeah, that's a gift. Truly, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Gretchen, Pamela wants to know if the recording of this presentation will be available to stream later.
Yes, I wrote in the chat that we will put it in the next few days on the Hotchkiss Library YouTube channel.
Great.
So by early next week.
Good.
And
So there'll be dozens more people who will be able to see this, which is wonderful. That's a real gift as well. Kathy wants to know, you mentioned, and I'm going to just slaughter the last name in the Danish, but we'll say it, Ditlevsen. You mentioned that her work has been translated into Norwegian. Do you think she influenced Knausgaard's memoirs?
Perhaps, because I've also read him and I feel like he is following in her, in her wake, following in her footsteps. So perhaps, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Excellent.
I can feel the similarities when I read him as well. Although I feel like her writing is even more pared down than his is. But I would love to share the most difficult part of translating this book, because I know we're we're running down on time, and I wanted to share that. So I have this really distinct memory of in part 2, where I finished translating and cleaning up chapter 5, where Tove is carried out of her house after her long addiction. And she's down to 65 pounds. And she's not a small woman, she was tall. And I think she was lucky to be alive. But she called the head psychiatrist at the hospital, and he sent an ambulance, and she was carried out to be driven to rehab. And I remember when I got to this point, I was like, wow, this is good and really dramatic. And I called my wife, and she was in the kitchen, I was in the living room, to tell her what just happened to Tove, that she was being taken to rehab in an ambulance. And at that point, it hit me that when I turned the page to keep translating, she was going to be going through withdrawal. And I remembered that when I had read the book, that was some of the most devastating writing I'd ever encountered. And that she was going to be going through withdrawal again when I turned the page, and that I was going to be going through it with her in my own way. And I just broke down sobbing in my wife's arms. I just couldn't handle it. And I realized that I had become really fragile from translating the book to that point, of accompanying her in a way through all of her traumas, small and large, and that I had taken some of them on. And I was really triggered by her struggles with love and anxiety and addiction, and that I needed some time. And I'd never done this before, but I'm going to take 2 weeks off. I'm not even going to look at this book for 2 weeks. And during that time, I called friends and family. I set up lunches with people, and I just talked to everyone about it. You know, this is what I'm doing, and this is what's happening, and this is what happened to her, and this is what's happening to me. And I wrote about it, and I meditated on it. And I started to realize some things, like, why was this so hard for me? And part of it was that I didn't want to see her suffer. And I saw how she was, despite all of her advantages and privileges, she had money, she had fame, she had a family, she had talent, she had good looks, and yet she fell prey to addiction so easily. And it made me realize how easy it is for other people too, to seek to avoid feeling bad. And that I do that too. And that I also have blind spots and things that I do repeatedly that are not necessarily in my best interest, because I'm escaping from something that's difficult. And that dependencies, whatever they are, you know, hers was drugs, but there are so many to choose from, that everybody, I think, falls prey to them in some way. There's a whole spectrum of dependence. And not only are they already there, that we have a society that in a way encourages consumption to excess. That we're confronted with images and role models that entice us to do more and more than perhaps is best for us. And so I began to see myself more as her equal and not better than her because she was addicted. And that really helped to open my heart and make me want a society that could also be more supportive and less judgmental of people who go, we have a tendency to blame people who go farther than is healthy. And I wish that we could spread more feeling of solidarity and goodwill. And that hopefully reading this book is a way that at least some people will get there, or help them to get there, as like the impression that it made on me.
Thank you, Michael. I can only rephrase Ingalise's tusen tak. And from my part, thank you very much for bringing Tove's world to us so that we can begin to understand it. Thank you. Gretchen?
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think she's an incredibly honest and generous, open writer, right? She was incredibly brave, and I applaud you as well, because you're very, very open and willing to share with us. So thank you so much. Much more than I certainly expected. I have one last question because I'm just very curious. How does one find out that their book has been named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times? Do they let you know ahead of time, or did you get a text from somebody saying, did you hear?
Gosh, I think it was the publicist for our Strauss and Giroux that found out
Ahead of time.
and told me that, hey, this happened. Yeah.
That's great.
And I actually have a blog about that on my website. You can read about how I reacted to this.
Oh, that's great.
But I also I'd like to address what you just said, that Tove was really gifted as a writer and used that to expose herself in such great detail as a gift to the future. And I use that as a role model for myself, and to challenge myself to try and expose my experience as cleanly and clearly as possible too. I'm also a poet, as many of you may know already. I've written 3 books of poetry, and it's part of what I try to do in my own writing as well, to expose my life in as few words as possible, just like Tove did. I'd like to share one poem, a really short poem with you, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So this is a title poem from Slow Phoenix. This is my book that came out last year. And this is a phoenix, as you know, is a bird from mythology that when it reaches a certain age, it bursts into flames and then arises from its ashes. So this poem is Slow Phoenix. Sometimes I feel resentful about having my problems. But as the days pass and I don't burst into flames, I'm thinking I have just enough problems to keep me moving. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for all of this. It's been really, really amazing. I knew it would be great, but I have to say it was really, really, truly wonderful. So thank you. We've done lots of these, so I can assure you this was really, really a high point in our presentations. Thank you to you so much, Michael, and thank you to our co-sponsors, Anne, and thank you to Holly, my colleague, for helping out. And thank you everyone for spending part of this cold, dark winter evening with us. I just want to invite you all back. Think about the summer, a hot August evening on Friday, August 5th. We hope to be back in person at our 25th annual Sharon Summer book signing under the tents on the Sharon Green after a 2-year pause. So fingers crossed that it's going to happen. We are planning, and Michael has already accepted an invitation to be there. So he will be able to sign copies of both the trilogy and the new collection of short fiction. So mark your count, and maybe one of your volumes of poetry, perhaps you could bring along as well. So,
okay, thanks.
Mark your calendars again for Friday, August 5th. And so thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to Essex and Norfolk Libraries, and check all of our websites out. We all have a lot of events coming up, so check them all out to see what's in the works, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night, everyone.